we'll have Elri. Elri is somebody I've had many conversations in Speaker's Corner with. Welcome, Elri. How are you doing?
Hello, Subur. Thank you for allowing me on. I won't take up too much. Thank you. Yes, I haven't had time to speak to you in a while. I heard of Hamza.
You haven't been coming to the park.
That is true. I haven't been in more than a year. Yes. So it's my fault really. I won't take up too much of your time.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
My question was basically to find out what are your views, or what are the Islamic views on the political doctrine of egalitarianism? Is egalitarianism part of Islam, or does it go against what Islam teaches? I just wanted to know from your opinion.
Sure. We can talk at Speaker's Corner, but I thought you and Hamza can have this conversation.
Yeah. Thanks very much.
Yeah, so your name is Ellery, yeah?
Ellery.
Ellery. Okay.
I believe you're a deist, right?
Good to hear from you, Ellery. Thank you for your time. So please educate me on what you mean by egalitarianism.
Sure, absolutely. Basically, in its basic form, egalitarianism is a political doctrine that stipulates that all people should be treated as equals from birth, usually mean treated equally under the law, and it also strives to remove inequalities among people and to get rid of discrimination on grounds of race, gender, sexual orientation, religion. So it strives to get rid of the discrimination that people might face, whether it's racial, whether it's gender-based, whether it's religious-based and sexual orientation, and everyone is treated equally under the law. So that's the basic premise of egalitarianism.
Yes, that's an interesting position. Now, obviously, I haven't studied this topic, so I'm just going to give you my intuitive type of response. So my first thing I would like to say to you is, please ask this question to someone who is far more qualified. I'm just having a conversation with you right now. I'm not giving you the Islamic position. This is not really my topic. So I like to prefer to stay in my lane, right? But just from a conversational perspective, if you allow me to, that I would just want to pose certain ideas that may make you think about this issue. Is that all right?
Sure, yes, please.
Yeah. So I think the problem here is, when it comes to thinking about the Islamic paradigm and other kind of doctrines, is in very important terms like equal, and what does that mean? So for example, let's break it down to the whole issue of gender. So from a kind of, if you have a kind of secular liberal backdrop, when you start talking about things like equality, then the understanding of that term is understood based on that kind of backdrop, that kind of secular liberal backdrop. But when we say equality, maybe even in the Islamic tradition, we would say, well, that would only make sense by virtue of understanding what is a male and what is a female. And in the Islam makes a clear distinction that the male and the female are different. Yes, there are similarities, of course, but there are certain differences. Also, God, who created us, he knows us better than we know ourselves. He gave us a way of life, a code, a social model, a system, whatever you want to call it, a set of ethics, a set of principles as well, general and specific, that basically allow us to basically live productive lives in a society where males and females can live a productive life that has increased well-being and decreased suffering, not only in this life, but also in the life to come. Because in Islamic tradition, when we look at doctrines or we look at things like this, we don't understand our ethics only from a worldly perspective. We also understand it from a other worldly perspective, because we're not secular, right? We understand things holistically. We understand that what we do in this life is going to affect the life to come.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Hamza. You've actually answered quite a lot by that response.
Oh, okay.
So I can get the gist. Then you basically then wouldn't support the idea of, say, I don't know, if a woman couldn't become a caliph under an Islamic state. It had to be a man. So whereas in a secular state, a woman could become a prime minister or become a president within Islamic law, I guess, in a caliphate, only a man could become a caliph. A woman wouldn't be allowed.
I see the orthodox position is not that a woman doesn't have the ability to become a caliph, but it's the position that a woman in the orthodox tradition would argue that a woman should not be a caliph by virtue of the rights and the responsibilities that have come from the creator. And remember, when you talk about the idea of what does it mean to be free, the conception of freedom is not just doing what you want, right? This is a kind of shallow understanding of freedom. But freedom is really that your rights have not been violated. And in the Islamic tradition, we argue that the one who has the right to give us our rights is the one who created us, right? And as long as those rights are not violated, then by definition, you are free. Okay.
Okay. So I see.
Yeah.
So, okay. It's coming from the creator. All right.
Absolutely.
That would make sense. That without even challenging you on that as a Muslim, that makes absolute sense from your paradigm. It makes sense.
But think about it principally, right? Even as like a doctrine or as an idea, and just stand in the possibility. So stand in the possibility that there is an all-powerful creator, and stand in the possibility that the all-powerful creator gave us guidance, and the all-powerful creator is all-knowing, all-wise, and the source of all goodness. Wouldn't it follow that if God commanded something, that those commands are best for us, given the fact that he knows everything, he's the most wise, and he's the source of all goodness? I'm not saying you have to believe in these attributes. I'm not saying you have to believe in this creator. I'm saying stand in the possibility that such a creator exists with these attributes, and when he commands something, now assess that command. What is the truth value of that command?
I understand that. So it goes without saying you would follow his commands. I don't dispute that. My point is that his commands and what he tells you to follow, which you follow, because obviously if you don't follow his commandments, that's a sin. What I'm saying is that that stuff would go against the political doctrine of egalitarianism. So, for example, egalitarianism says there shouldn't be discrimination in religion. So people of different belief systems would be allowed to worship. And obviously, I think within Islam, polytheists wouldn't be given that privilege. They wouldn't be allowed to build their shrines and their temples under Islamic law. So that, in that sense, that's why I think egalitarianism would clash with Islam.
Well, I don't think even egalitarianism is even workable from that perspective, because it's almost impossible to basically have what you would call tolerance with no boundaries. You can't have boundless tolerance. It just doesn't make sense, just by virtue of the realities that we're talking about. So you have minorities, you have people with different ideas and values. You know, as a state, you'd have to have certain principles. Fine, even if you're a liberal state, you know, you can't convey the conception of a good life, but there are some things that you still have to hold on to. There's going to be all of these things that interplay, right? There's going to be some things that you just have to draw the line. You have to say, yeah, we're tolerant to a degree. So this type of egalitarianism, the way you are portraying it, is, I'm telling you, almost impossible. It's never going to work, just by virtue of understanding the realities on the ground. So, for example, let's take, for example, what kind of nation would you say is one of the most egalitarian nations on this planet?
The nations which have striven, is that a word? Strived to achieve it would be obviously France with the revolution in 1789. And then it had its declaration, it had its Declaration of the Rights of Man. Then, of course, the USA tried it with the 1776 Declaration of Independence, where it talks about all men are created equal. But it wasn't a law. It was something that they followed and got inspiration from. So it took them more than a century to actually start to implement it properly, because at first in the 18th century, even though they claimed to be using it, they still had slavery, and women were still discriminated against. So it was an inspiration as a philosophy, but it wasn't a law. So people cherry picked it, but over time, they've started using more and more of it. And so obviously, if we come to the 21st century, in that secular society, I would say, women have more rights. They can work as long as they want, or they can, and some people argue against it, and they have good or bad reasons, but I don't to take us down that road. But
Sure.
yeah, I would say France, the United States of America, even Britain. I would give examples of those places.
So really, if you break it down, egalitarianism is basically trying to maximize freedom for people, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so you have the maximization of freedom, and not only do you want to maximize freedom, but that freedom entails obviously that you have to give people rights, correct?
Precisely, but they don't have absolute freedom because they are laws which will challenge.
Yeah, I get that. So,
okay.
But you want to maximize freedom, and by the looks of it, the only way to do that is by giving people certain rights and ensuring that you have the mechanisms in place, the infrastructure in place, the laws in place in order for that to happen. Now, so really, if you break it down, and this is someone just talking to you intuitively right now, because this is not really my area, as I said in the beginning, but if you break it down, what's very interesting here is it's really about the idea of freedom itself. So when we're talking about freedom, sometimes we have a particular conception of freedom because we already think that people should be given these set of rights. Yeah. Now, I want you to stand in the possibility that actually, well, let's try and think outside of the box here, or let's be critical in our thinking, because if freedom is the absence of coercion, and the absence of coercion is not just you not being coerced, but really is that your rights are not violated, because there could be situations that you're coerced and you still would say that your rights have not been violated and therefore you're still free. And there could be situations where you seemingly there's some kind of coercion, but you wouldn't say the person is not free. So we could unpack that much more philosophically, but what I want to get you to understand is fundamentally freedom is about rights. Now, you can have a negative view on rights or a positive view on rights. You could believe your rights are very few and fundamental, or you could have a more kind of positive approach to rights, like the socialists, for example. And, there's an obligation to give these people rights according to the kind of positive view. Now, depending on what set of rights you want to give to people, that is going to dictate whether you think people are free, right?
Well, not so much free. It's about being equal. And when I say equal, I'm not.
But
saying...
why be equal? So what I want to get here is, what is the ultimate utility of egalitarianism? Why do you want people to all be equal? Because there is supposedly a presupposition, I could just guess now, and you could correct me, that equality would actually maximize freedom for people.
I don't know about maximizing freedom. I know when you look at philosophers like Locke, he says things like that everyone at all times and places has equal natural moral rights, and that all of us ought to always to respect those natural moral rights.
Yes, that's I don't think anyone would disagree with that. But then one would argue is, well, what are those rights, and who has the right to give us those rights?
Yes, and this is where I believe that then there's a clash between egalitarianism and Islam, because in Islam that comes from your God, Allah. Allah is the one who decides. Whereas within egalitarianism, that is more man-made. That is more man-made in its philosophical belief of how someone should have rights. So I believe they clash.
Brilliant. So the real discussion, therefore, is not about, is egalitarianism a workable doctrine, or what do you think about egalitarianism? I think the real discussion, which I've been trying to allude to, is that, well, really it's about rights here. We're having this discussion about rights because equality is linked to that, freedom is linked to that. So what we can say is, well, really the fundamental question we should be asking each other is, what are these rights? And who has the right to give us these rights? And that now opens the door to a kind of philosophical metaphysical discussion in a way, because there are very few things that could come to mind that are metaphysically free, meaning that you don't have some kind of philosophical presuppositions. Because even egalitarianism within a secular liberal model, it's going to have a particular conception of rights anyway that's in line with a secular liberal understanding. Now, in order for those rights to be true, then you need to now justify the philosophical premise, which is secularism and liberalism. Well, let's have that discussion. So this is why it's very important to bring it down to the fundamentals to understand where the Muslim is coming from and where the secular person is coming from.
Oh, I understand that part. What I needed was confirmation that as a Muslim and in Islam, you would reject egalitarianism and you would reject liberalism because there are basic things there that I see would go against your beliefs. So like the freedom of religion, as we discussed earlier, you wouldn't want to give polytheists the equality or the freedom to build shrines and build their temples.
Now there's an interesting use of language here, which we need to be very careful about. Because generally for the popular mass, when you say you don't believe in freedom of religion, like, oh my God, you're oppressive. Islam, that's the wrong term to use, because Islam is well known in its history and is in its philosophy and in its source texts, namely the Quran and the prophetic traditions, that we have this, you know, unprecedented understanding of giving people rights, to the degree where when the Ottomans took over Constantinople, they actually preserved Christian minorities. When Christians were killing Christians, you had the Ottomans that actually preserved the religious freedom of other Christian sects. I think it was the Jacobite.
So I don't dispute that, Hamza, but I was very specific about the religion. I didn't choose an Abrahamic one. I chose one which was polytheism.
Allow me to finish the point. So is there a religion that egalitarianism would actually reject as well? Of course there is. You could think about many religions that egalitarianism would totally reject, right? So if a religion came up that harmed people, or something that went against the rights that are dictated by the egalitarian doctrine that is premised on secularism and liberalism, of course they would not tolerate that religion, right? Or they would attempt to secularize it, right, from that perspective. So it would be a bit unfair to show, look, egalitarianism has this open door to everybody, and Islam, you know, the polytheists will just don't tolerate them.
No, I agree with what you said, especially the part where you said that egalitarianism would secularize. I would agree. So you would find in a society where Satanists would be allowed to call themselves Satanists, but of course they wouldn't be allowed because of the secular laws to go around killing people and sacrificing them to Satan. They would become, as you mentioned, secularized.
So logically speaking, they would basically not tolerate that religion. So what you need to understand here is, as I said in the beginning, there is no such thing as a boundless tolerance, right? And this is why to basically juxtapose egalitarianism with Islam in this way can subconsciously try to show Islam as something, you know, not in line with one's natural moral outlook. Whereas the reason I'm having this discussion, being very careful with the language, you know, to use freedom of religion in that way is unhealthy, because the door can swing both ways, even from the most, you know, so-called open egalitarian society. There are going to be boundaries, mate. Yeah. So from that perspective, it brings us back to the same point. Who has the right to draw these boundaries? Who has the right to give us our rights? And we would have this healthy discussion to say that, well, if God does exist, he did send down a revelation. We can show that God exists, and we can show that this revelation is from the divine. And we can show that these commands are actually the commands of God, and we understand them in the way that they were intended in our modern context. Then if they are implemented and applied in our modern context, I truly believe it would maximize the well-being of all people in general, and it would basically minimize the harm of people in general as well. So really, a lot of these questions, whether you said doctrine X or doctrine Y, you could call it egalitarianism or liberalism or secularism, fundamentally they boil down to this fundamental issue. A lot of it is going to be talked about the boundaries of tolerance, and a lot of it is going to be talked about, a lot of the things that we're going to talk about is, well, what rights, what conception of rights are we talking about, and who has the right to give you these rights? And
sorry, Hamza, before you finish, because I understand you guys have been quite patient, giving me a lot of time. Just to conclude, so from that, because I asked you earlier about, like, you know, equality and a woman would be allowed to become a prime minister or a president. Would that be the same under Islam? Would she be allowed to become a caliph? And would the people have the right? The people wouldn't have the right to vote for the caliph either. Whereas in egalitarianism, which gets merged with democracy, the people vote for the leader, and the leader can be a man or a woman. And just to conclude, that wouldn't be the case in Islam. Or can it be the case in Islam?
from my reading, I haven't read on this. As I said in the beginning of this conversation, it's not my area, but the discussion we've had so far has been very productive from the point of view that we understood that it goes down to worldview and the way we see the world, and understanding who has the right to give us the rights and who has the right to give us the boundaries to our, who has the right to draw the boundaries.
And I just wanted to, from you, your opinion. What would God's view be on that?
From my understanding, I haven't read into this, so you have to check out and ask someone, is that the author is understanding that a woman would not have that type of political authority. That would be the orthodox understanding, the mainstream classical understanding, rather. I know the word, using the word orthodox is a bit, not the best word to use, but the mainstream classical Islamic understanding of someone running a state, then for sure a woman would not do that. But then I said earlier, does that mean a woman intrinsically doesn't have the ability? That doesn't necessarily follow, because we also have the whole concept of, leadership in the Quranic narrative, the Queen of Sheba, so on and so forth. So we understand from that perspective, it's not because there's an intrinsic deficiency in the woman, right? That argument could possibly be made. But as I said, this is not my area of study, so you'd have to ask someone who actually knows much more. But I think what is very important, this is just a subsidiary question, really, if you think about it, because if it was the main question, then obviously you would have raised the whole issue about gender, but it was more about egalitarianism and doctrines. And what we've realized here, which is very important, that really when we're talking about boundaries to tolerance and we are talking about conception of rights, if you're thinking within a particular paradigm, then obviously any other paradigm is going to be clashing, because alternative paradigms, they have their own philosophical understanding of the world. So this has been a very powerful conversation, because to unpack these ideas, whether it's egalitarianism, whether it's liberalism, secularism, nationalism, communism, whatever the case may be, we have to go right down to the philosophical presuppositions, or to the first principles, or to the fundamental ideas that they adopt, which shapes their worldview.
I agree with that. I agree. I'll just put it out there so both of you know. I'm a fan of liberalism. I am a fan of egalitarianism. I don't think they're perfect, but I do love the fact that there is freedom of religion, freedom of speech to politically criticize without fear of arrest in most cases. I don't believe that would exist naturally within a feudal state, whether it's using religion, because I think if you started speaking out against the Caliph, I think you would be rounded up and dealt with severely. So
I don't think there's freedom of speech. Freedom of speech doesn't exist anywhere, bro.
Well, this is the thing. There is the definition by the philosophers, and then there is its implementation in a secular society with the law. So you'll get something like the Human Rights Act of 1998, which will talk about freedom of expression. And then you'll have all these other laws like the Public Order Act of 1986. Obviously, if you use your freedom of speech to be abusive, to threaten, then you break the law. So as I said earlier, the philosophy is an inspiration. It is not like a religion where it has to be followed. It's an inspiration, and you build from that inspiration laws.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think it's more complicated than that, because freedom of speech is not just about law. It's about values. So Dr. David Van Mill, the academic who talks about this freedom of expression, he makes a really powerful point. And he basically says that freedom of speech is, you can't see in abstraction. Freedom of speech, is basically in competition with other values, okay? So it's not necessarily just law. So it depends on what society actually values. Now, the absolutists, which don't really exist in academia or in the political sphere, but you have some of them, and frankly, I think they're very imprudent. But nevertheless, they're like, no, you must have no restrictions whatsoever, because they say if you have any form of restriction, even in law, it's a slippery slope to what you call tyranny. But then the door swings both ways, because if you don't have any restrictions at all, then it's a slippery slope to anarchy. Right?
I agree with that. I mean, my inspiration would come primarily from people like John Locke when they talk about freedom of speech. I don't believe he's talking about absolute freedom of speech, and he was quite very conservative and religious. So
here's the problem. Because I'm gonna be authentic with you right now, yeah, which I've tried to be a lot these days, hopefully in my older age. you know, I'm not going to let you get away with giving me a party political broadcast that why liberalism is so great and using words like freedom of speech. Yeah.
No. I didn't say it is great.
I'm not saying that.
I'm a fan of it. I like it, but I didn't say it's brilliant.
I'm not saying it's brilliant, but I'm saying throwing those terms in there in a way that maybe the unlearned or a listener on these topics would be like, oh, you know, liberalism has all these amazing things. I'm not going to let you do that. Yeah. Okay. Obviously, it's our platform, so you know we won't let you do that.
But first, do you think it has anything good in it?
No. Listen, I'm not the one to throw any baby, you know, with the bathwater, right?
Okay.
What I'm trying to say here is that even the concept of a shubha is like a destructive doubt in the Islamic tradition. Tushbihu, it resembles something that is not. Like the classical scholar Ibn Taymiyyah said, that even these things that are false, like destructive doubts, the reason people hold on to them sometimes because there is an element of truth in them. So I'm not going to say that, you know, just because it's an alien ideology, there's no element of truth in any of them. But in the conversation, in the discourse, we can unpack certain things. All I wanted to say is when it comes to freedom of expression, you follow John Locke. What about John Stuart Mill? The harm principle. How do you define harm? You know, what kind of understanding of ethics are you going to have? Are you going to have a understanding, a utilitarian understanding? Even if you have that, what is your utilitarian calculus, right? How are you going to understand that something is going to, you know, diminish the harms and increase the goods and increase the well-being? So the point here is the whole thing of freedom of speech becomes a very ideological issue. And it's, you know, liberalism doesn't have this kind of what you would call a monopoly on allowing people to express themselves. In actual fact, in practical reality, especially when you go to France, something that you cited as a positive example of egalitarianism is actually something that, with all due respect, is the antithesis of freedom of speech. Look what's happening on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram today. If you say anything that's slightly what they would call anti-vax, for example, I'm not saying that's my position, but I'm just saying, you know, they're like, oh no,
anti-woke.
Yeah, or anti-woke. You know, you have people, you have these organizations that are like, you know, the bastions of freedom of speech that are clamping down on these people. Why? Because there are competition of values, and freedom of speech doesn't exist in isolation, in a vacuum. It's in competition with other existing values. The point I'm trying to say here is, when we talk about freedom of speech, does freedom of speech have intrinsic value, or is it instrumental? I want you to answer these questions if you can. So does
I think freedom of speech does have it does have value. So I mean, to me, like I mentioned earlier, I gave an example.
Let's discuss what we mean by value here. It's important. So when you say freedom of speech has value, does it have value by virtue that it leads to other goods? It's an instrument, it's a means to other ends, or is freedom of speech an ends in itself?
No, it's a means to other ends. So, for example,
it has no intrinsic value. And the funny thing
I'm saying that it has value in helping us, for example, to develop. So, from the world of education, when we use freedom of speech, when we use freedom of speech to learn things, whether it's about the cosmos, and even though there are people who are trying to suppress that knowledge, it is helping man to become better. So that's what I mean when I see intrinsic value. And then I mentioned earlier the politics. If you want to complain about something which is a wrong in society, it allows you to do that. So we've got the education furthering man's mind. 100%. We've got freeing yourself from political bondage. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, good. So that's what David Van Mill says as well, which is very interesting, that, you know, you cannot show that freedom of speech has any intrinsic value, especially in a secular naturalistic context, right? So it's an instrument. I agree. So the kind of main objectives of freedom of speech, especially historically, is you could summarize it in the following ways, which I think you've just said yourself. So we're in agreement here. So to express yourself is important, and to not have obstacles to that expression, because it facilitates truth, it facilitates progress, and it facilitates accountability. Correct?
Yes, I would agree with you there. With those.
Yeah. So absolutely. So from that perspective, can you challenge the Caliph? Can you challenge a leader of the Muslim population? Can you challenge a ruler in the Islamic tradition? 100%. Full accountability. Full accountability. We have very famous stories. For example, the famous story of the companion of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Umar ibn al-Khattab, may God be pleased with him, radiallahu an. He basically, you know, stood up and was giving the sermon, and he said, you know, that he wanted people to take him to account. I mean, that's not the full narrative, but that's the gist of the story. To the point where I believe someone was waving the sword saying, we're going to strain you with this, right? Now, the point of view is that the full accountability is embedded in our tradition, right? Even progress. Now, when you look at the values of Islam that were implemented, especially historically, obviously, I don't like to over-glorify Islamic history. I think it's a sign of a defeated mind, because a lot of bad things happen too. But you could trace the good to the Islamic principles for sure. You know, there was this kind of, especially when you look into Islamic Spain, the social values that were implemented in Islamic Spain created this kind of paradise on earth, as some academics call it, right? A convivencia, coexistence of people to look into the interconnecting principles of nature concerning science and astronomy and literature and mathematics and so on and so forth. So, you know, does liberalism have a monopoly on truth, accountability, and progress? Absolutely not.
Yes, absolutely not. And I would say that I would quickly say that those Muslims in Spain, depending on the dynasty, whether it was the Umayyad, the Almohad, the Almoravid, they were quite they were quite liberal-minded in their use of science, in their allowing of architectural skills or political discussion, philosophical discussion. They were quite liberal-minded. I'm not saying they were liberalists, don't get me wrong, even though I use the word liberal. I'm not saying they were following John Locke or anything, but they were quite liberal. But I understand a lot of what you're saying, and I can see how these things would clash with certain teachings within Islam. I don't want to take up too much of the time. I just wanted to say, Hamza and Subur, thanks for letting me on. It was enjoyable. Maybe some other time I'll bump into Subur in Speaker's Corner again. But,
are you coming this Sunday?
No, I won't. Not this Sunday. I'll be busy. Busy enjoying the Christmas holidays. Maybe next. Maybe.
Why not do it at the park with a bunch of strangers?
And, well, no disrespect to the strangers, but I'll be enjoying it with a family. So they take precedent. So precedence, I can't get the word right. But apart from that, I look forward to hopefully seeing you again, Subur, in the park.
Yep.
And Hamza, I've seen you in a lot of videos, debates, and I know you used to come to the park a long time ago, but you stopped coming. But it's been a pleasure talking to both of you. Thanks for your patience and your time.
Thank you for your time.
Take care. Goodbye.